They expected execution, but the Americans handed them hot dogs and Dr. Pepper instead. September 3rd, 1945. Camp Hearn, Texas. 47 German soldiers knelt in the dust outside the barracks, hands behind their heads, eyes fixed on the ground. Their uniforms were torn, stained with sweat and North African sand that had followed them across an ocean. The sun beat down mercilessly on the Texas plains, turning the compound into an oven. They had surrendered 3 weeks earlier in Tunisia, expecting bullets. Instead, they got a cargo ship, a train ride through America that felt like a hallucination. And now this, a sprawling compound of wooden structures under a sky so impossibly blue, it hurt to look at. The youngest among them, a 19-year-old machine gunner named Klaus Weber, whispered to no one in particular, "They're going to starve us now," just like Goebbels said. No one contradicted him. Every man kneeling in that Texas heat had heard the same propaganda for years. Americans were cruel, barbaric. They tortured prisoners, worked them to death, denied them food and water. The Reich had been clear. Surrender meant suffering worse than battle. Better to die fighting than to fall into Allied hands where humiliation and slow death awaited. Weber's throat was raw from thirst. They'd been given water on the train, but that felt like hours ago. His stomach cramped with hunger. The last meal had been breakfast, some kind of bread and weak coffee, but nerves had made it impossible to eat more than a few bites. Now, kneeling in the dust, he regretted not forcing down more food while he had the chance. A door slammed somewhere behind them. Footsteps approached. Weber tensed, bracing for whatever came next. In his mind, he cycled through the propaganda he'd absorbed. Americans scalped prisoners. They beat them with clubs. They withheld medical care and let wounded men die screaming. One particularly vivid poster he'd seen in 1943 showed an American soldier standing over a German prisoner with a bayonet. The caption reading, "This is what awaits cowards who surrender." The footsteps stopped. Weber kept his eyes on the ground, heart hammering. Then he heard a sound he couldn't identify at first. A hiss, then another, and another, like air escaping from something under pressure. When he finally looked up, a sergeant stood before him holding out a glass bottle, dark brown with condensation dripping down its sides. The label read, "Dr. Pepper," in letters Weber couldn't pronounce. The bottle was so cold that moisture beaded on the glass, reflecting sunlight in tiny prisms. "Drink," the sergeant said in broken German, his accent thick but understandable. "It's cold. You need water." Weber stared at the bottle like it might explode. His mind couldn't process what was happening. This wasn't part of the script he'd been given. Americans didn't offer cold drinks to prisoners. They didn't speak gently. They didn't. "Take it," the sergeant said again, this time with a hint of impatience. "We got plenty. Don't let it get warm." Around him, other prisoners received the same offering. Hans Miller, a veteran of the Eastern Front with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, was handed a bottle of Coca-Cola. Friedrich Steiner, the radio man who'd lost 2 fingers to frostbite in Russia, got Pepsi. A few received something called Royal Crown Cola. One man, Werner Koch, who'd been a baker in Hamburg before the war, refused his bottle entirely, convinced it was poisoned. "They put something in it," Koch hissed in German, "to make us talk, or to kill us slowly." But Weber was too thirsty to care. He took the Dr. Pepper with shaking hands, twisted off the cap, and brought it to his lips. The first sip almost made him choke. The carbonation was aggressive, bubbles fizzing violently in his mouth. The sweetness was overwhelming, almost painful. He hadn't tasted sugar, real sugar, not the synthetic substitute Germany had been using since 1941, in over a year. His body didn't know how to process it. He coughed, eyes watering, but took another sip. This time he was ready for the carbonation. The liquid was so cold it made his teeth ache. The flavor was bizarre, something like cherry, something like spice, something entirely unfamiliar. But it was wet, and he was desperately thirsty, so he drank. Around him men were having similar reactions. Müller took a long pull of his Coca-Cola and let out an involuntary sound. Half gasp, half laugh. Steiner stared at his Pepsi bottle like it was a religious artifact. Even Koch, who'd refused to drink, pressed his bottle against his forehead, seeking relief from the heat. Then came the food. Not thin soup ladled from communal pots. Not black bread that crumbled into sawdust. Not the watery coffee substitute that had sustained them for months in the Africa Corps. The Americans brought out trays, actual metal trays, the kind you'd see in a cafeteria, piled with hot dogs. Real meat, encased in soft white buns that looked impossibly fresh, topped with mustard and something red that Weber later learned was ketchup. Alongside them, potato chips still crispy, fresh from the bag, pickles, cookies that smelled like vanilla and butter, and more of those impossibly cold bottles of soda. Weber took his tray with trembling hands. The hot dog was still warm. Steam rose from the bun. He lifted it to his nose and inhaled deeply. The smell of cooked meat, real meat, was intoxicating. How long had it been since he'd eaten actual beef or pork? Months? A year? He bit into the hot dog and had to close his eyes. The meat was juicy, seasoned with salt and spices he couldn't identify. The bun was soft, pillowy, nothing like the dense black bread that had been standard rations. The mustard was sharp and tangy. The ketchup added sweetness. It was the most delicious thing he'd ever tasted. Around him, men began to eat, slowly at first, cautiously, still half expecting some cruel trick. But hunger overrode caution. Hans Müller bit into his hot dog and wept openly, tears streaming down his scarred face. Not from joy, from confusion, from the collapse of every certainty he'd carried into captivity. "This doesn't make sense," Müller said, his voice shaking. "We're the enemy. We killed their soldiers. We destroyed their tanks. We fought them across North Africa. Why are they feeding us this? Why are they treating us like people?" No one had an answer. The question hung in the air, suspended between bites of hot dog and sips of Dr. Pepper. Before we continue with this story, take a moment to like this video if you're finding it interesting, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories like this. Also, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? What do you think about this story so far? Your engagement really helps the channel grow. The Americans didn't explain. They simply distributed more food, more bottles, more impossible abundance. A corporal with a slight southern accent moved among the prisoners, telling them in halting German that this was standard procedure, that every prisoner received the same treatment, the same rations, the same access to the camp exchange where they could buy candy bars and cigarettes with the wages they'd earned from labor. Weber stopped mid-bite. Wages? They would be paid for working? That made no sense either. Prisoners weren't paid. They were exploited, worked until they dropped, then replaced. That's how it worked in every system Weber understood. But the corporal kept talking. "You work. You get 80 cents a day. Scrip, not real money, but you can spend it at the exchange. Buy Coke, candy, cigarettes, whatever you want. We got a whole store set up. 80 cents a day to buy luxuries." Weber's mind struggled to process this information alongside everything else. He looked down at the half-eaten hot dog in his hand, at the Dr. Pepper bottle sweating in the Texas sun, at the potato chips he hadn't even touched yet, at the American soldiers who weren't beating them, weren't mocking them, weren't doing anything the propaganda had promised. And for the first time since his capture, Klaus Weber realized that everything and he'd been told about the enemy might be a lie. Not just exaggerated, not just twisted for morale purposes, but fundamentally, completely, catastrophically false. The thesis. This story reveals how the simplest acts of abundance can shatter ideology more completely than any bullet. For 47 German soldiers who surrendered in Tunisia, the war didn't end with their capture. It ended with their first taste of Dr. Pepper, their first bite of an American hot dog, their first realization that the enemy they'd been taught to fear had resources so vast, so casually distributed, that even prisoners ate better than German civilians ever had. What follows is the story of how democracy tasted like carbonation, how freedom came wrapped in wax paper, and how the American prison camp system accidentally deployed its most effective weapon. The truth about what abundance looks like when it's not reserved for elites. It's the story of men who expected death and received dignity instead, and how that single reversal destroyed every certainty they'd carried into war. To understand what those hot dogs meant, to truly grasp the psychological earthquake they triggered, you have to go back 6 months, back to Tunisia in early 1943. where these men still believed in victory. The Afrika Korps had been Germany's pride, Rommel's elite force hardened by desert warfare and convinced of their superiority. Klaus Weber had enlisted in September 1942, just 17 years old, swept up in the fervor that still gripped Germany despite mounting losses on the Eastern Front. The recruitment posters showed strong-jawed soldiers standing victorious beneath swastika flags, promises of glory and honor echoing through every speech, every newsreel, every classroom. Weber believed it all. Why wouldn't he? Germany was strong. Germany was righteous. Germany would reshape the world into something better, cleaner, more orderly. The Führer had said so, and the Führer was never wrong. His parents had reservations. His father, a veteran of the First World War, knew the cost of combat. But they didn't stop him. How could they? By 1942, dissent was dangerous, and besides, the propaganda machine was too powerful to resist. Every radio broadcast reinforced the message: Germany was winning. The Allies were weak. Victory was inevitable. Weber's training lasted 3 months. Physical conditioning, weapons training, ideological instruction. The officers told them the Allies were decadent, incapable of real sacrifice. Americans, especially, were soft, a mongrel nation of immigrants with no discipline, no warrior spirit, no capacity for the kind of total mobilization that defined the Reich. They've grown fat on luxury, one officer declared during a political lecture. They don't understand hardship. They won't fight when things get difficult. They'll crumble. The propaganda about prisoners of war was even more specific. Allied forces, they were told, violated the Geneva Convention routinely. They tortured captured Germans. They withheld medical care. They forced prisoners into labor camps where conditions rivaled the worst Soviet gulags. Surrender meant slow death, humiliation, suffering worse than anything battle could inflict. Better to die with honor than live as their slave, the officers repeated like a mantra. Weber absorbed these lessons without question. When he shipped out to North Africa in January 1943, he carried absolute certainty. He fought for the righteous side, and the enemy was subhuman. But the Afrika Korps was already dying. Supply lines had collapsed under Allied air superiority. Ships carrying food, ammunition, and fuel were sunk before reaching North African ports. Rations dwindled from adequate to meager to nearly non-existent. Soldiers who once received meat twice weekly now subsisted on thin soup, black bread when available, and ersatz coffee made from roasted barley that tasted like burnt dirt. Weber's first month in Tunisia was defined by hunger, not the acute starvation of total deprivation, but the grinding, exhausting hunger of insufficient calories. He grew thinner. His uniform hung loose. His thoughts became sluggish, focused entirely on the next meal. When food ran low, the officers explained it away. Temporary setbacks, transport issues. The Führer has a plan. Victory is certain. But Weber noticed things that contradicted the official narrative. The way officers hoarded cigarettes while enlisted men went without. The way rations designated for frontline troops somehow never reached the front. The hierarchy was absolute. Officers ate first, then specialists, then infantry. If anything remained, the wounded got it. Everyone else made do with whatever scraps survived the chain of command. Then came the collapse. By April 1943, the Afrika Korps was surrounded, cut off, starving. Allied forces tightened the noose methodically. German positions fell one after another. Ammunition ran out. Medical supplies vanished. Men died from infected wounds that would have been treatable weeks earlier. Weber's unit held a position outside Tunis, firing on advancing Allied forces with dwindling ammunition. On May 11th, their commanding officer gathered the survivors, fewer than 60 men from a company that had once numbered over 200. "We're surrounded," the officer said flatly. "No ammunition, no supplies, no reinforcements coming. We surrender tomorrow morning." The announcement was met with stunned silence, then panic. "They'll kill us," someone said. "They'll torture us," another added. "We should fight to the last man, die with honor." But the officer shook his head. "We fight with what? Empty rifles? Rocks? No. We surrender. Maybe some of us survive." That night, Weber couldn't sleep. He lay in his trench, staring at stars that looked exactly like the stars over Germany, and tried to imagine what came next. Execution seemed most likely. The propaganda had been clear. Americans showed no mercy. The Geneva Convention was a joke. Prisoners faced beatings, starvation, forced labor until death. He thought about his family, his mother who'd cried when he enlisted, his father who'd said nothing but gripped his shoulder hard enough to bruise, his younger sister who'd made him promise to write. Would they ever learn what happened to him? Or would he simply vanish, another name on an endless list of casualties? May 12, 1943. The surrender happened at dawn. Weber and his comrades laid down their weapons and walked forward with hands raised. American soldiers moved forward to meet them. And that's when the first crack in the propaganda appeared. No one shot them. Instead, American soldiers patted them down for weapons, checked them for injuries, and then, impossibly, handed out canteens of clean water. Weber took the canteen with shaking hands, expecting it to be yanked away as a cruel joke. But the soldier simply nodded and moved to the next prisoner. Weber unscrewed the cap and sniffed cautiously. It smelled like water. Just water. He took a small sip, waiting for the poison to take effect. Nothing happened. He took a longer drink. The water was clean, cool, free of the alkaline taste that characterized desert wells. It was the best water he'd tasted in months. Around him, other prisoners were having similar realizations. American medics moved among the wounded Germans, providing first aid without hesitation. No mockery, no cruelty. Just efficient, professional medical care. Hans Müller, the scarred veteran, watched an American medic bandage his infected hand and whispered, "Why are they doing this?" The medic didn't understand German, but another prisoner translated. The medic shrugged. "Geneva Convention. You're POWs now. We treat you right." The confusion intensified at the temporary processing camp outside Tunis. The Americans served them food, not scraps, but actual meals. Pancakes with syrup, scrambled eggs, sausage, milk, coffee, real coffee, dark and bitter and wonderful. Men who hadn't seen an egg in 2 years stared at their plates in disbelief. Some refused to eat, still convinced it was poisoned or drugged. Others ate slowly, reverently, tears streaming down their faces. "It's propaganda," Müller insisted. "They're fattening us up for something worse, just wait." But nothing worse came. Instead, they were given access to showers, hot water, soap, towels. They received clean clothes to replace their torn uniforms. They were processed through medical examinations where doctors checked for diseases and injuries with genuine concern. Weber couldn't reconcile any of it with what he'd been taught. The Americans were supposed to be barbaric. Instead, they were methodical, fair, even kind. It made no sense. 2 weeks later, they were loaded onto a cargo ship bound for America. Not into a cramped hold with prisoners packed like livestock, but into converted quarters with bunks, blankets, and ventilation. 3 meals a day, access to latrines, medical staff on board to handle any health issues. The crossing took 2 weeks. Every morning, American sailors distributed breakfast, oatmeal, toast, jam, coffee. Every afternoon, lunch, sandwiches, soup, fruit. Every evening, dinner, meat, vegetables, bread, sometimes even dessert. By the 3rd day, most prisoners had stopped refusing food. By the 7th, they were asking for seconds. By the time they reached America, some had actually gained weight. Weber spent the voyage in a state of cognitive dissonance. Everything he witnessed contradicted everything he'd been taught. The Americans had refrigeration on their ships. They wasted food casually, threw away half-eaten sandwiches, poured out coffee they didn't finish. The abundance was staggering. Even more disturbing was the racial integration he witnessed. Black American soldiers ate the same food as white ones, slept in the same quarters, received the same treatment. This violated everything Weber understood about racial hierarchy. The Reich had been explicit. Races must remain separate, with Aryans naturally superior. Yet here were black soldiers and white soldiers working side by side, treating each other as equals. When the ship reached America, the propaganda collapsed entirely. The train ride from the East Coast to Texas took 4 days through a country that seemed impossible. They traveled in passenger carriages, not cattle cars. Guards distributed box lunches, fried chicken, potato salad, pie, fresh fruit, bottles of cold milk. The civilians they passed at train stations didn't jeer or throw stones. Some waved. Children pointed curiously. At one station in Tennessee, a woman approached a guard and handed him a bag of apples to distribute to the prisoners. "Why?" Weber asked the guard in broken English. "Why give food to enemy?" The guard, a farm boy from Iowa, shrugged. "You're prisoners, not animals. Geneva Convention says we gotta treat you right. Besides," he gestured vaguely at the passing countryside, "we got plenty. Plenty." That word haunted Weber. He stared out the window at American cities that hadn't been bombed. Factories running at full capacity. Farms with livestock grazing peacefully. Highways filled with automobiles. More cars in a single stretch of road than he'd seen in his entire life in Germany. The infrastructure was intact. The population looked healthy, well-fed, prosperous. Meanwhile, he knew, everyone knew, that German cities were being reduced to rubble. That civilians queued for hours with ration cards that provided less each month. That children were forgetting what chocolate tasted like. By the time they reached Camp Hearn in September 1945, Weber had started to suspect the unthinkable. That Germany had never stood a chance. That the enemy's strength wasn't propaganda, but observable reality. That surrender might not mean death, but revelation. And then the Americans handed him a Dr. Pepper and a hot dog, and the last pillar of his belief system shattered completely. The first 24 hours at Camp Hearn felt like a controlled hallucination. Real, but impossible. After the initial meal that had left 47 German soldiers stunned and suspicious, the Americans began processing them through administrative routines that made no sense to men trained in Wehrmacht efficiency. Everything about the camp contradicted the propaganda they'd internalized for years. First came the showers. Guards led them to a large concrete building with rows of shower heads mounted on white-tiled walls. Each man received a bar of soap. Real soap, not the gritty substitute German troops had used since 1941, along with shampoo that smelled faintly of herbs and a clean towel. The water was hot, unlimited. Men who hadn't bathed properly in months stood under the spray until their skin turned pink, until guards gently informed them others were waiting. Klaus Weber scrubbed his skin until it hurt, trying to wash away more than dirt and sand. When he emerged, clean clothes waited on a bench. Denim work uniforms stamped with PW on the back in black stencil, but new, sturdy, well-made. No lice, no holes, no stench of sweat and fear baked into the fabric. He dressed slowly, marveling at how the shirt fit, how the pants had a working zipper instead of fraying rope. Then came the medical inspection. A U.S. Army doctor, a captain, judging by his insignia, examined each prisoner methodically, checking for wounds, infections, signs of malnutrition. Weber watched as medics treated Friedrich Steiner's infected foot wound with genuine concern, applying antiseptic that made Steiner hiss through his teeth, then wrapping it in fresh white bandages. The doctor spoke no German, but his translator, a young corporal who'd grown up in a German-speaking household in Milwaukee, conveyed instructions clearly. "You'll be seen again in 3 days. If the pain worsens before then, tell the guards immediately. Don't wait." Weber couldn't process it. In the Wehrmacht, medical care followed strict hierarchy. Officers received treatment first, then specialists with technical skills, then regular infantry if supplies remained. Combat medics were overworked and undersupplied, often forced to choose who lived and who died based on rank and strategic value. Here, the Americans treated a low-ranking corporal's foot infection with the same attention they'd give their own soldiers. After medical processing came barracks assignment. The buildings were simple wooden structures painted olive green, but solid. Inside, rows of bunk beds stretched the length of the room, each with a real mattress, not a straw-filled sack, but an actual mattress with springs, along with a pillow and 2 wool blankets. Electric lights hung from the ceiling. A coal stove sat in the center for heating during colder months. The windows had screens to keep out insects, but no bars, no heavy locks. Hans Müller examined the barracks with the paranoid thoroughness of a man who'd survived 3 years on the Eastern Front. He checked the windows, the door, the bunks, looking for the trap he knew must be coming. "Where are the chains?" he asked quietly. "Where are the guards inside the barracks?" A sergeant overheard and answered through the translator. "You're not chained. You're prisoners of war, not criminals. Guards patrol outside the perimeter and do head counts. You stay in your assigned barracks at night. That's it. Simple rules. Follow them, and there's no problem." That evening, the mess hall opened for dinner. The prisoners filed in, still half expecting the hospitality to end, the cruelty to begin. Instead, they found long wooden tables set with metal trays, cups, and actual utensils: forks, knives, spoons. The kitchen staff, composed entirely of American soldiers, served each man a full plate. Meatloaf glazed with something brown and sweet, mashed potatoes with butter melting into pools, green beans still steaming, bread, white bread, soft as clouds, with more butter, and coffee. Real coffee, dark and bitter and wonderful. For dessert, canned peaches and syrup. Weber stared at his tray. The portion size was larger than what German officers received in the field. The quality exceeded anything he'd eaten since enlisting, and this was just dinner on a random Tuesday in September. Not a special occasion, not a reward for good behavior, just standard prisoner rations, served without ceremony or explanation. Around him, men ate in near silence, too overwhelmed to speak. A few still refused to touch the food, convinced it was drugged or poisoned. But most ate slowly, reverently, trying to make each bite last, trying to memorize the taste before it vanished. Werner Koch, the baker from Hamburg who'd refused the Dr. Pepper that afternoon, finally broke. He took a small bite of meatloaf, chewed cautiously, then burst into tears. Not quiet tears, but racking sobs that shook his entire body. 2 guards moved toward him and Weber tensed, expecting violence. Instead, they simply asked through the translator if he was all right, if he needed medical attention. "No," Koch managed. "I'm fine. This is better than what my children eat at home. My children are starving and I'm eating like this. It's not right." The guard didn't know how to respond to that. He simply nodded and moved on. After dinner, the Americans distributed small items from cardboard boxes: toothbrushes, toothpaste, razors, shaving cream, combs. Again, Weber felt disoriented, unmoored from every certainty he'd carried. Why give prisoners grooming supplies? Why treat captured enemies with this level of basic dignity? What did the Americans gain from it? The answer came 3 days later when the camp commander, a colonel with graying hair and a face that suggested he'd seen too much combat, addressed them through a translator in the main courtyard. The prisoners stood in formation while he spoke from a small wooden platform. "You are prisoners of war," the commander said, his tone firm but not hostile. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. That means you will work, and you will be paid wages for that work, 80 cents per day in camp scrip. You will receive 3 meals daily, medical care when needed, and access to the camp exchange where you can purchase additional items. You will write letters home once monthly, which will be censored but delivered through the Red Cross. You will obey orders, respect the guards, and follow camp rules. In return, you will be treated with fairness and dignity." He paused, letting the translator finish. "I know what you were told about America. I know what your leaders said we would do to you." His expression hardened slightly. "They lied. You'll see that soon enough. Most of you already have." The commander left. The prisoners stood in stunned silence, processing words that rewrote everything they thought they knew. That afternoon, the camp exchange opened for business. The building looked like a small general store transplanted from rural America, shelves stocked with goods that seemed impossible. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, Royal Crown Cola, all chilled in metal coolers with sliding glass doors. Candy bars, Hershey's, Mars, Milky Way, Snickers, Baby Ruth, displayed in neat rows with prices marked in chalk, 5 to 10 cents each. Cigarettes, Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield, tobacco for rolling, fresh fruit when available, canned goods, instant coffee, and in one corner a small refrigerated case with ice cream. Ice cream in a prisoner of war camp. Weber bought his first Hershey bar with trembling hands, using scrip advanced against future wages. He unwrapped it slowly, the chocolate scent almost unbearable after years without. The first bite was overwhelming, rich, sweet, creamy, tasting like a childhood he'd almost forgotten. He ate half and carefully rewrapped the rest, unable to believe he was allowed to keep it, to save it for later, to eat it whenever he wanted. That night, lying in his bunk with a full stomach for the first time in over a year, Weber replayed everything in his mind. The hot showers with unlimited water, the medical care given without regard to rank. The full meals served 3 times daily, the camp exchange selling luxuries for pocket change. The complete absence of cruelty, mockery, or deliberate suffering. He thought about the propaganda, about Goebbels' broadcasts promising that American captivity meant torture and death, about the officers who swore Germany's enemies were subhuman barbarians incapable of mercy. And he realized, with a clarity that made his chest physically ache, that he had fought for a regime built entirely on lies. Nothing in the propaganda had prepared these men for this. The weeks at Camp Hearn settled into a rhythm that felt surreal in its normalcy, almost like civilian life except with guards and fences. Prisoners woke at 6 to the sound of a bell, attended roll call in the courtyard, then filed into the mess hall for breakfast. Oatmeal or scrambled eggs, toast with jam, coffee, sometimes bacon or sausage. After breakfast, they reported to work assignments based on skills and physical capability. Some went to nearby farms for agricultural labor, harvesting vegetables and maintaining equipment. Others worked maintenance tasks around the camp, painting buildings, repairing fences, cutting grass. A few with kitchen experience helped prepare meals alongside American cooks. The work was physical but not punishing. Guards supervised but didn't drive them with cruelty or violence. And at the end of each workday, every man received his wages, 80 cents in camp scrip, carefully recorded in individual account ledgers they could check weekly. For Klaus Weber and the others, small human moments began accumulating into something larger, a transformation they couldn't quite name but felt happening nonetheless. It started with language. Guards and prisoners exchanged basic words across work details and fence lines. Good morning became Guten Morgen. Thank you turned into Danke. One guard, a farmhand from Iowa named Corporal Jensen, learned enough German to joke with the prisoners about the relentless Texas heat. Hotter than hell, yeah? Jensen would say, grinning and wiping sweat from his forehead. You boys from Africa thought you knew hot. Texas says hold my beer. The prisoners would laugh despite themselves, despite the strangeness of sharing jokes with the enemy. Then came the music. On Saturday evenings, the camp allowed prisoners to gather in the recreation hall, a large wooden building with benches, and a stage where someone had placed an old upright piano. A former music teacher from Hamburg named Ernst Hoffmann played Beethoven, Brahms, and Schubert. American guards stood outside listening, some visibly moved by the familiar melodies. One evening, Jensen requested for Elise, and Hoffmann played it 3 times in a row while Jensen stood at the doorway, eyes closed, transported somewhere beyond the war. My mom used to play that, Jensen said quietly afterward. Every Sunday morning. Thank you. Hoffmann nodded, unable to speak. Food continued to be the most jarring element of camp life, the constant reminder of American abundance. Thanksgiving 1945 arrived, and the camp kitchen prepared the traditional American feast for all prisoners. Roast turkey with savory stuffing, mashed potatoes swimming in rich gravy, candied sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, green beans with almonds, fresh-baked rolls, pumpkin pie topped with whipped cream, coffee, and cold milk. 47 German prisoners received the exact same meal as the American soldiers stationed at the camp. No distinction, no hierarchy. Enemies and captors eating identical portions on the same day. Weber saved a piece of pumpkin pie, wrapping it carefully in a napkin. He stared at it for hours that night, unable to reconcile this abundance with the reports arriving in letters from home. His mother writing about hunger, describing how ration cards now provided barely enough bread to survive. His sister explaining that children fainted in school from malnutrition, that classmates had died from diseases weakened bodies couldn't fight. His father detailing how the monthly ration of meat had been reduced to practically nothing. The camp exchange became a Friday ritual. Every week, Weber bought a Coca-Cola and a Hershey bar with his wages. He drank the soda slowly on a bench outside the barracks, savoring the carbonation and sweetness. The chocolate he ate in tiny pieces throughout the week, trying to make it last. Sometimes he bought cigarettes to trade for extra items with other prisoners. Other times, he purchased canned goods, Spam, beans, peaches, and instant coffee, which the camp allowed prisoners to mail home through Red Cross parcels. That reversal struck him harder than anything else. Prisoners sending food to Germany instead of receiving packages from home. By November 1945, Weber was mailing his family American chocolate, canned meat, coffee, and powdered milk. His mother's letters described the parcels as miracles, food that kept them alive when government rations failed completely. The emotional weight of that reality, that his captors fed him better than his own nation could feed his family, was almost unbearable. There were moments of unexpected human connection that transcended the categories of enemy and prisoner. One afternoon in October, while working on a farm detail harvesting cotton, Weber and Private Morris took shelter from sudden rain under a barn overhang. Morris offered Weber a cigarette, Lucky Strike, not the harsh German tobacco, and they smoked in silence, watching water pour off the corrugated metal roof. "You got family back in Germany?" Morris asked after a while. "Yes. Mother, father, sister," Weber replied in his improving but still broken English. "They okay?" Weber hesitated, choosing words carefully. "Hungry. Very hungry. City is destroyed. Bombs." Morris nodded slowly, taking a long drag. "My brother's in France right now, stationed near the Rhine with the occupation forces. Says the German cities are bad. Real bad. Like nothing left." They finished their cigarettes without speaking further. But something had shifted in that moment. They weren't enemy and prisoner. They were two men in their 20s, caught in a war neither had chosen, worrying about people they loved who were suffering thousands of miles away. Christmas brought another shock to the system. On Christmas Eve, the camp distributed care packages to every prisoner. Inside each box, candy, cookies, toiletries, writing paper, envelopes, and a small gift item. Some received harmonicas, others got decks of playing cards or paperback books. A few found small wooden crosses. The packages weren't from the Red Cross or the U.S. military. They were from American civilians, church groups, women's clubs, civic organizations, who'd organized donation drives specifically for German POWs. Hans Miller, the hardened Eastern Front veteran who'd wept over his first hot dog, opened his package and found a hand-knit scarf with a note attached. "Stay warm this winter." From a mother in Kansas who prays this war ends soon. He held the scarf for a long time, saying nothing, his scarred face unreadable. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his footlocker like a religious relic. Weber's package contained a harmonica and a note that read, "Music crosses all borders. May it bring you comfort. God bless you." He'd never played a musical instrument, but he taught himself over the following weeks, practicing in the evenings until he could manage a halting, imperfect version of Silent Night. On Christmas Eve, he played it for the other prisoners in his barracks, and several men wept openly. By early 1946, something fundamental had changed. The prisoners had stopped refusing American food, stopped suspecting poison, stopped waiting for the cruelty to begin. They'd seen too much evidence to the contrary. Medical care that saved lives, wages that allowed small luxuries, letters from home that arrived regularly despite the chaos in Germany, and abundance so casual it was distributed to enemies without hesitation or second thought. Weber wrote to his mother in February, "I cannot explain what I have seen here. America is not what we were told. I am fed better as a prisoner than German soldiers at the front. I have chocolate, coffee, soap. The guards are fair, the work is reasonable. I do not understand what this means for Germany's future, but I know with certainty we were lied to about everything. But nothing lasts forever in wartime, and new orders were about to change everything once more." The repatriation orders arrived in May 1946, delivered with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had characterized everything about Camp Hearn. After 11 months of hot meals, clean water, and treatment that contradicted every piece of propaganda they'd absorbed, Weber and 46 others were informed they'd be transferred to ships bound for Europe. The war had been over for a year, but Germany remained a shattered landscape of rubble, hunger, and military occupation divided between American, British, French, and Soviet zones. Most prisoners felt deeply conflicted about returning, relief at going home mixed with dread of what they'd find there. On their final day at the camp, the Americans provided a parting meal that deliberately mirrored their arrival 15 months earlier. Hot dogs with all the fixings, Dr. Pepper, Coca-Cola, potato chips, pickles, and cookies. This time, no one refused the food. No one suspected poison. No one hesitated. The men ate quietly, fully aware that this abundance would end the moment they crossed back over the Atlantic. Corporal Jensen, the Iowa farmhand who'd learned German phrases and requested for release from the piano player, shook hands with several prisoners as they boarded the trucks to the train station. His eyes were red, though he tried to hide it. "Good luck over there," he said in his rough but understandable German. "Hope you find your family safe. Hope you can rebuild." Weber shook his hand firmly, unable to find adequate words in any language. "What do you say to an enemy who treated you with more humanity than your own officers ever had?" The journey back to Germany was nothing like the journey to America. The ship was crowded, the rations adequate but no longer generous, the mood somber and apprehensive. Men who'd gained weight in American captivity, some as much as 20 or 30 pounds, braced themselves for what awaited. A homeland destroyed, families scattered or dead, cities reduced to skeletal ruins. Weber landed in Bremen in early June 1946. The port was devastated. Twisted metal, collapsed warehouses, craters where buildings had stood, ships half sunk in the harbor. He was processed through a British-run transition camp, given identification papers, a small amount of occupation currency, and instructions to report to local authorities in his hometown for registration. The train ride took 2 days through a Germany that bore no resemblance to the nation he'd left in 1942. Every city visible from the windows was rubble. Frankfurt, Mainz, Cologne, all reduced to broken brick and twisted steel. Civilians at stations looked skeletal, hollow-eyed, dressed in rags or patched clothing held together with safety pins and hope. Children begged for scraps of food, their legs thin as branches, their bellies distended from malnutrition. The infrastructure had collapsed entirely. No electricity in most areas, no running water in many neighborhoods, minimal food distribution through ration cards that provided less each month. The contrast with America was so stark it felt obscene. When Weber finally reached his family home on the outskirts of Munich, he found it partially destroyed. One wall blown away by bombs, the roof patched with salvaged sheet metal. His mother answered his knock and collapsed into his arms, sobbing. She'd aged 20 years in the 4 he'd been gone. Her hair had gone completely gray. Her hands were skeletal, knuckles swollen from malnutrition and hard labor. His father had died the previous winter from pneumonia complicated by starvation. There'd been no medicine, no doctor available, no hospital with space to treat civilians. He'd simply grown weaker until he stopped breathing one February night. Weber's sister, now 16, looked like a child of 10, her growth stunted by years of insufficient food. She hugged him with surprising strength, her thin body trembling. "The packages you sent saved us," she whispered. "When the ration cards stopped coming, we had your chocolate, your canned meat, your coffee. We traded some for bread. It kept us alive." Weber felt guilt crash over him like a physical wave. He'd spent the past year eating Thanksgiving turkey and buying Coca-Cola while his family starved. The disparity was crushing. Over the following weeks, Weber tried to explain what he'd seen in America. His mother didn't believe him at first. "Prisoners don't eat turkey," she said flatly. "You're confused. Memory plays tricks after trauma." But Weber had proof. The Red Cross parcels he'd mailed, some of which his family had saved portions from. His sister had kept the wrappers, Hershey's chocolate, Spam cans, Maxwell House coffee tins, treasuring them like religious artifacts because they'd meant survival. "These kept us alive," she said, showing him her small collection. "When we had nothing, we had what you sent." Slowly, as other POWs returned, people began sharing similar stories. Men who'd been held in camps across America described hot showers, full meals, camp exchanges, medical care, wages for work, and treatment that contradicted everything Goebbels had promised. The accounts were consistent, detailed, undeniable. The psychological impact rippled through communities. These men had fought for a regime that promised strength, purity, and inevitable victory. Instead, they'd discovered an enemy with resources so vast, distributed so casually across society, that even prisoners ate better than German officers in the field. The propaganda hadn't just been wrong, it had been completely inverted. Weber struggled with this knowledge daily. He worked construction jobs, helping rebuild the Munich neighborhoods that Allied bombs had destroyed. He married in 1950, a young widow whose first husband had died at Stalingrad, and they had 3 children. He rarely spoke about the war, rarely mentioned his time as a prisoner, but he kept 2 items from his captivity in a small wooden box on a shelf: an empty Dr. Pepper bottle and a Hershey's wrapper, both carefully preserved. His wife asked about them once. "Reminders," he said simply, "of the day everything I believed turned out to be lies." The nightmares came periodically, not of battle, but of the moment he'd bitten into that first hot dog at Camp Hearn and realized with absolute certainty that his nation had sent him to die for a fantasy built on propaganda, while people with actual strength, the Americans, had resources so abundant they fed their enemies better than Germany fed its own children. In 1973, a German journalist working on a documentary about American POW camps tracked Weber down through veteran records. The interview took place in his living room, with his grown children listening silently from the kitchen doorway. "What surprised you most about American captivity?" the journalist asked, his tape recorder running. Weber thought for a long moment, choosing words carefully. "That they treated us like human beings. We'd been taught they were monsters, barbarians who would torture and kill us. But they gave us food, medicine, dignity, respect. They didn't have to. We were enemies. We'd killed their soldiers, destroyed their tanks, fought them across North Africa. But they fed us anyway. Better than our own army ever did. Better than our government fed German civilians." "Did it change how you viewed the war?" Weber's expression hardened. "It destroyed how I viewed everything. I realized we'd been fighting for lies from the beginning, that the strength we'd been promised was hollow propaganda, that our leaders had sent us to die for a fantasy, while our families starved. The Americans didn't defeat us with bullets. They defeated us with hot dogs and Dr. Pepper, because those simple things revealed a truth we couldn't deny, that we never stood a chance against a nation with that much genuine abundance." The journalist leaned forward. "Do you feel bitterness about that?" Weber shook his head slowly. "I feel grateful. Grateful I survived. Grateful the Americans treated us with mercy we didn't deserve. And grateful I learned the truth in time to teach my children that ideology built on lies always collapses when it meets reality." Klaus Weber died in 1989, just months before the Berlin Wall fell and Germany began its reunification. He was 66 years old, having lived a quiet life as a construction foreman, a husband, a father of 3, and eventually a grandfather of 7. His obituary in the Munich newspaper mentioned his service in North Africa and his time as an American prisoner of war, but it didn't capture what those experiences had truly meant. His eldest daughter found the wooden box while sorting through his belongings. Inside, an empty Dr. Pepper bottle, glass clouded with age but still intact, and a flattened Hershey's wrapper preserved between 2 pieces of cardboard. Also in the box was a photograph. Weber and several other prisoners standing in front of a barracks at Camp Hearn, dated September 1945. On the back, written in faded pencil, "The day everything changed." She asked her mother what the items meant. "Your father said they were the most important things he owned," his widow explained. "More important than his medals or his discharge papers. He said they represented the moment he learned that truth is more powerful than propaganda." The other prisoners from that group of 47 scattered across Germany after repatriation, but many kept in contact through letters and occasional reunions. Hans Müller, the scarred Eastern Front veteran, became a schoolteacher in Hamburg. He dedicated his career to teaching German students about the dangers of propaganda and the importance of critical thinking. Friedrich Steiner opened a small radio repair shop in Berlin. Werner Koch, the baker who'd wept over his first meatloaf, returned to his trade and never spoke about the war except to say, "I learned that enemies can be more merciful than friends, and that changes everything." In the 1970s and 1980s, as German historians began seriously examining the POW experience, several patterns emerged from interviews and archived records. German prisoners held in American camps had dramatically lower mortality rates than those in Soviet camps, less than 1% compared to nearly 30%. They received medical care that exceeded what German military hospitals provided their own wounded. They were paid wages, allowed to send money and packages home, and treated according to Geneva Convention standards even when Germany itself had violated those same conventions in its treatment of Soviet and other prisoners. But the most significant finding was psychological. POWs who returned from American captivity showed markedly different political views than those who'd remained in Germany or been held elsewhere. They were less likely to harbor continued Nazi sympathies, more likely to support democratic reforms, and more willing to acknowledge Germany's war crimes. The experience of being treated humanely by enemies they'd been taught to hate had fundamentally altered their worldview. American military strategists hadn't intended this outcome. The Geneva Convention treatment of German POWs wasn't psychological warfare. It was simply adherence to international law and American logistical abundance. The United States had the resources to feed prisoners well, so it did. It had the medical supplies to treat them, so it did. The fact that this accidentally undermined Nazi propaganda was a side effect, not a planned operation. But the effect was profound nonetheless. 47 men who'd expected death received hot dogs and Dr. Pepper instead. They experienced abundance so casual, so widely distributed, that it revealed the fundamental lie at the heart of Nazi ideology, that strength came from hierarchy, deprivation, and total mobilization. America demonstrated that genuine strength came from abundance so vast it could be shared even with enemies. Weber's children learned this lesson from their father, though he rarely spoke about it directly. Instead, he taught through small moments. When his son complained about school lunch in 1962, Weber responded, "You have lunch. You have a school that's still standing. You have teachers who aren't trying to fill your head with lies. Be grateful." When his daughter asked in 1968 why they should trust American democracy during the Vietnam War protests, Weber said, "I'm not telling you to trust blindly. I'm telling you to think critically, to demand evidence, to question propaganda from any source. The Americans aren't perfect, but I learned this. A system that treats enemies with dignity has at least some moral foundation. A system that builds itself on lies about enemies has none." The Dr. Pepper bottle and Hershey's wrapper eventually went to a small museum in Munich, dedicated to examining daily life during and after World War II. They sit in a display case alongside other artifacts from POW camps: ration cards, camp script, letters home, photographs of barracks and mess halls. A placard explains their significance. These ordinary American consumer goods represented an extraordinary revelation for German POWs. Many had been taught that America was weak, decadent, and unable to sustain a war effort. Instead, they discovered a nation with such abundant resources that even prisoners received luxuries unavailable to German civilians. This cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality proved more effective at undermining Nazi ideology than any re-education program could have been. School groups visit the exhibit regularly. Teachers use Weber's story, and others like it, to illustrate how propaganda works and why critical thinking matters. Students handle replica Dr. Pepper bottles from the 1940s, taste Hershey's chocolate, and try to imagine what it would feel like to have everything you believed completely inverted in a single afternoon. The lesson resonates across generations. In 1945, Weber learned that his enemies were more human than his own propaganda had been. In 2025, 80 years later, that lesson remains vital. That ideology built on lies about the other, whether racial, national, religious, or political, cannot survive contact with truth. The hot dogs and Dr. Pepper weren't just food and drink. They were evidence. Physical, undeniable proof that everything the Reich had promised was false. Germany hadn't been strong. It had been hollow, sustained by propaganda and coercion. America hadn't been weak. It had possessed strength so vast it could afford to be generous even to enemies. Weber understood this in September 1945, kneeling in Texas dust with a cold bottle in his hands. The carbonation fizzed against his tongue, the sweetness overwhelmed his senses, and in that moment, the entire architecture of Nazi ideology collapsed. Not through argument or debate, but through simple, observable reality. The war ended twice for Klaus Weber and 46 other German soldiers. It ended first in May 1943 when they surrendered in Tunisia, expecting execution and receiving water instead. But it ended truly on a September afternoon in Texas when an American sergeant handed Weber a Dr. Pepper, and the entire structure of propaganda he'd internalized crumbled in a single carbonated sip. Democracy didn't announce itself with speeches or manifestos. It tasted like chocolate and fizzed like soda. and it was distributed so casually that prisoners received portions as generous as citizens. Sometimes the most devastating truths arrive not through violence or argument, but through the simple, undeniable evidence of abundance shared without hierarchy or hatred. Weber carried that lesson for 44 years, taught it to his children, and preserved it in a bottle and a wrapper he kept until his death. The message remains clear across decades, that enemies who treat you with unexpected humanity reveal more about the strength of their system than any propaganda ever could. And that truth, once experienced, can never be fully unlearned.